The 19th-Century Bernanke by Lil Byrne, read by Floy Lilly. There is something disarming about a technocrat. While it's easy to dismiss elected officials as blustering panderers, there is something comforting in the image of the specialist civil servant toiling away with industry and equanimity, poring over statistics like a Hellenic priest, scientifically examining entrails, and carefully allocating resources like an Egyptian vizier. The technocrat seems benign, yet crucially important, and above the fray. This is certainly the image that has been cultivated by Federal Reserve Chairman. One remembers Alan Greenspan with his prominent brain case and thick glasses, uttering technical jargon just arcane enough to assure the markets that all was well with the Greenspan put. And we are regularly presented with Ben Bernanke, the bearded sage, comfortingly citing statistics that show how government remedies are working their way through the economy, however egregiously wrong he may be. This aura surrounding technocracy has grown especially since the civil service reform of the late 19th century, but technocrats have been striving for it for much longer. This striving can be seen distinctly in the person of Nicholas Biddle, 1786 through 1844, one of the more interesting characters in United States history. Starting in 1822, Biddle was the president of the American Central Bank that preceded the Fed, the second bank of the United States. Biddle was initially reluctant to take the job. A scion of high society Philadelphia family, Biddle had no stomach for the indecorum of politics. He ultimately accepted the position, however, stating that the bank was of vital importance to the finances of the government and an object of great interest to the community. His disdain for competitive democracy, in his words, the violence of party, and his esteem for the bank merged into a fervent belief that the bank should always be above politics. He implemented that belief as policy in his tenure as bank president. He proudly declared, "There is no one principle better understood by every officer in the bank than that he must abstain from politics. The course of the bank is very clear and straight on that point. We believe that the prosperity of the bank and its usefulness to the country depend on its being entirely free from the control of the officers of the government, a control fatal to every bank which it ever influenced. In order to preserve that independence, it must never connect itself with any administration and never become a partisan of any set of politicians." In the 20th and 21st centuries, Federal Reserve Chairman carried on this tradition of jealously guarding the Fed's independence. Witness Ben Bernanke's recent warnings that the Federal Reserve Transparency Act would politicize the Fed. As we shall see, in practice, Biddle, like Bernanke, was not against politics per se, so long as it was conducted in an unpublicized, gentlemanly manner. The political climate during the early years of Biddle's tenure seemed to perfectly suit his temperament and attitude toward governmental institutions. In an interview with the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, who was in Philadelphia conducting research for his book, Democracy in America, Biddle explained how American politics had been tamed and a placid consensus had emerged in recent years. For a long time we were divided between Federalists and Republicans. Those two parties were very like what you have in Europe. They had political doctrines to which interest and emotions were attached. They fought bitterly until the Federalist Party, always short in numbers, was completely crushed by its adversary. Tired of their vanquished position, the Federalists ended up by giving up their own cause. They either merged in the successful party or rallied under other names about questions of detail, but the party standard has really been knocked down for good and all. Since then, there have been people who support the administration and people who attack it, people who extol a measure and people who abuse it. But there are no parties, properly so called, opposed one to the other and adopting a contrary political faith. The fact is that there are not two practicable ways of governing this people now, and political emotions have scope only over the details of this administration and not over its principles. In other words, under the new consensus, there was no need for debate. It was simply a matter of civil servants like Biddle himself dutifully implementing wise policy. Tocqueville didn't completely buy Biddle's story. As H.W. Brands wrote, perhaps because his own experience of aristocracy was deeper than Biddle's, Tocqueville detected a continuing struggle between the few and the many in America. Tocqueville believed that aristocratic and democratic passions were always present, and though they may slip out of sight there, they are, as it were, the nerve and soul of the matter. Tocqueville was right, and the democratic passions he spoke of found their embodiment in the person of Andrew Jackson, who became President of the United States in the 7th year of Biddle's tenure. In many ways, Jackson was Biddle's opposite. While Biddle was the quintessential, apolitical civil servant, Jackson was a volatile populist who considered himself the champion of democracy. Jackson hated the prevalent political atmosphere as much as Biddle loved it. Where Biddle saw consensus and benign paternalism, Jackson saw an entrenched establishment ridden with corruption. He had first-hand experience with the cozy, back-scratching ways of the Republican political monopoly throughout his public career, and especially during his first failed attempt at the presidency in 1824. Of the three chief candidates of that election, Jackson was clearly the most popular. But there was an electoral deadlock, so the race had to be decided by the House of Representatives. Through a backroom quid pro quo with rival candidate Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams ended up winning the House vote and, as a result, the presidency. So Jackson came into office after finally defeating Adams in 1828 with a large chip on his shoulder against the Republican establishment. He also had a distinct disliking for Biddle's bank in particular. Despite the contrary characterizations of later historians, Jackson, who was not only a soldier but a lawyer too, was a studious and thoughtful, if intemperate, man, and he was an ardent, hard money advocate. His monetary opinions were informed by contemporary hard money theorists and his own readings concerning the South Sea bubble of 1720. He rightly blamed the bank for the Panic of 1819 and had been a leader in the fight against inconvertible paper money in Tennessee. Jackson displayed his disregard for the bank moderately in his first annual message. Both the constitutionality and the expediency of the law creating this bank are well questioned by a large portion of our fellow citizens, and it must be admitted by all that it has failed in the great end of establishing a uniform and sound currency. Biddle responded to Jackson's remarks with patronizing nonchalance. They should be treated as the honest, though erroneous, notions of one who intends well. In a later meeting, Jackson warned Biddle that he thought the bank was unconstitutional. Yet Biddle continued to not take the president seriously. He characterized Jackson's position as a mere idiosyncrasy. As such, it is far less dangerous, because if the people know that this is not an opinion which they must necessarily adopt as a portion of their party creed, but an opinion of the president alone, a very honest opinion, though a very erroneous one, then the question will be decided on its own merits. Biddle's attitude continued even after Jackson's erroneous opinion of the bank showed itself to be persistent. In respect of General Jackson and Mr. Van Buren, Jackson's vice president, I have not the slightest fear of either of them or both of them. I think we can defend the institution from much stronger enemies than they are. Biddle's patronizing dismissiveness toward Jackson was a gross underestimation. Jackson was as tough as they came. He fought in the War for Independence as an adolescent and bore a scar on his face from a saber blow he received for refusing to clean a British officer's boots. His body was riddled with the scars of a lifetime of duels, brawls, and battles. He also had the people on his side. He was considered the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, who rescued the honor of the new nation toward the end of the War of 1812. And he was swept into office in a wave of popular anger at the corrupt political establishment. All in all, he was not a man to be taken lightly. The bank's charter was not up for renewal until after Jackson's first term. Biddle initially liked it that way because, in keeping with his desire to shelter the bank from politics, he did not want its renewal to be an election issue. He figured that even if Jackson were re-elected as a second-term president, he would likely be less popular and thus less of a threat. The scheming Henry Clay, then a congressman, who cared more about becoming president himself than preserving the bank, wanted Biddle to apply for an early renewal of the charter. Jackson was so popular that Clay needed a potentially explosive issue like the bank's rechartering to stir the pot, or else the president would glide into an easy re-election. Of course, this would put the bank more at risk, but he convinced his benefactor, Biddle. Biddle had used his bank position to help Clay in his chronic debt problems, that an early renewal would be a sure thing. He wrote to Biddle from Washington, "Have you come to any decision about an application to Congress at this session for the renewal of your charter? The friends of the bank here, with whom I have conversed, seem to expect the application to be made. My own belief is that if now called upon, President Jackson would not negative the bill, but that if he should be re-elected, the event might and probably would be different." Thus did Clay manipulate Biddle into faithfully applying for an early renewal. Biddle wrote to Congress in 1832, "We have determined on applying to the present Congress for a renewal of the charter." And he couldn't help but slip in a remark insisting that this decision had nothing to do with tawdry politics. "Neither I nor any of my associates have anything whatever to do with the president or his election. I know nothing about it and care nothing about it." Despite such repeated proclamations, Biddle didn't mind writing propaganda articles promoting the bank and bribing newspaper editors to run them. Biddle wrote to one such editor, "If you will cause the articles I have indicated, and others which I may prepare to be inserted in the newspaper in question, I will at once pay to you $1,000. Now, this was public money that he was offering. Of course, he insisted, there is nothing in this communication which he should care to conceal. Nonetheless, he requested that the editor return the letter as it might be misconstrued. This was exactly the discreet, gentlemanly corruption that Jackson abhorred. The bank's most vocal supporter in Congress was Daniel Webster. Even though Webster had staunchly opposed the bank's original charter, he discovered the merits of the bank, quite coincidentally, when he found himself on its payroll. At the peak of the renewal controversy in which Webster was playing a leading role, Webster wrote to Biddle, "I believe my retainer has not been renewed or refreshed as usual. If it be wished that my relation to the bank should be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainers." The renewal bill passed both houses of Congress, but was vetoed by Jackson. But Clay's machinations backfired. The bank veto proved to be a fillip for Jackson's popularity, and he went on to win a landslide re-election. Biddle knew that a major follow-up to Jackson's victory could conceivably be to remove the Treasury's deposits from the bank. This would be a crippling blow, because unlike the Fed, the bank's money creation power was limited by the gold standard. But even after his first defeat, Biddle's swaggering confidence continued. "They will not dare to remove them," Biddle told Webster. "If the deposits are withdrawn, it will be a declaration of war which cannot be recalled." But Jackson knew that Biddle had already been conducting a surreptitious war. His Attorney General, Roger Taney, presented to Jackson evidence that Biddle and the bank had deliberately manipulated the money supply just before the renewal bill was to be deliberated over. Taney asked rhetorically, "Can any impartial and unprejudiced mind doubt the motive? Was it not to compel the people to continue its monopoly and privileges, not on account of the benefits conferred by it, but to escape from the suffering which the bank had the power to inflict?" Taney also provided evidence of Biddle's corruption of the press. Provoked by Biddle's appalling machinations, Jackson prepared to remove the federal deposits from the bank. Treasury Secretary William Duane balked at the idea, warning Jackson that Biddle might retaliate by creating a financial panic. The idea that the bank could have the power to do such a thing only strengthened Jackson's resolve to end it. He announced his final decision to withdraw the funds to his cabinet. In his address, he remarked, "The bank has by degrees obtained almost entire dominion over the circulating medium, and with it power to increase or diminish the price of property, and to levy taxes on the people in the shape of premiums and interest to an amount only limited by the quantity of paper currency it is enabled to issue." In this speech, Jackson demonstrated a recognition of how central bank money manipulation can impose an inflation tax and create housing bubbles. If only there was such awareness among the members of today's elected officials. So the reader can know that the appalling nature of Biddle's response to Jackson's decision isn't only an Austrian take on the incident. The following 4 quotations are excerpts from Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times, by the mainstream historian H.W. Brands. The decision when it came didn't surprise Biddle. His spies had informed him of the debates within the administration. He considered a preemptive strike by buying off vulnerable members of the administration and Congress. He planned to do so by offering them bank positions. "In half an hour," he boasted to an intimate, "I can remove all the constitutional scruples in the District of Columbia, half a dozen presidencies of bank branches, a dozen cashierships, 50 clerkships, 100 directorships to worthy friends who have no character and no money." But he held back, not quite believing that Jackson would really go through with removal. With such a writhing multitude of sinecures at Biddle's disposal, it is no wonder Jackson called the bank a hydra of corruption. Biddle launched a counterattack. He called in loans, tightened credit, and otherwise reduced the bank's financial exposure. To complement his fiscal tightening, Biddle went ahead with his bribery, offering lucrative positions to Jackson loyalists if they would abandon the president and join the bank. The attack on the money supply had an immediate effect, starting in the nation's financial capital. The financial panic spread from New York across the country. Banks collapsed in Washington and Philadelphia, while a Boston paper described conditions there as absolutely frightful. But Biddle maintained his chokehold on the money supply. Biddle's Machiavellian arrogance reached a crest in his response to the crisis he generated. My own view of the matter is simply this. The projectives of this last assault on the bank regret and are alarmed by it. But the ties of party allegiance can only be broken by the actual conviction of existing distress in the community. Nothing but the evidence of suffering abroad, that is, in the country as a whole, will produce any effect in Congress. This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges, he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken. As is well known to readers familiar with Austrian business cycle theory, Biddle's contraction of money substitutes that were pyramided on top of the species supply was actually a good thing. It only brought on the necessary correction that, if postponed further, would have eventually been even worse. But obviously his motivations for the action were deplorable, as well as highly telling regarding the attitude of central bankers. Jackson was beset by petitioners suffering from the panic and legislators challenging the constitutionality of his action. He told his vice president, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Jackson was vindicated in standing his ground. Within months, the correction was over, economic growth resumed, and Biddle's power was broken. In 1836, the bank's charter expired. It limped on for 5 more years as a non-federal bank before finally going bankrupt. 4 years after that, Biddle died at age 58. Like Ben Bernanke today, Nicholas Biddle cultivated the veneer of a benign civil servant, seated serenely above the political fray. In reality, he, also like Bernanke, was up to his neck in the backroom game of power. And when Biddle's bureaucratic cradle was rocked, he quickly morphed into a Machiavellian monster. Keep that in mind as Ben Bernanke gets progressively cornered by Ron Paul and the End the Fed movement. When you hear about the Federal Reserve Transparency Act getting stalled in committee, think of Daniel Webster, bought and paid for with central bank money. When you read Fed apologia in the New York Times, The Economist, and the Wall Street Journal denouncing the reckless populism of the act, think of the newspaper editors in Biddle's pocket. Most of all, when you see Ben Bernanke on television respectfully insisting upon the Fed's independence and gently warning of the economic consequences of any restrictions upon it, think of Nicholas Biddle, an outwardly mild-mannered fellow who would wreck a whole nation's prosperity in order to cling to power. Libertarian historian Lord Acton said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And the corrupt banking magnate Mayer Amschel Rothschild said, "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." Those two dictums, taken as dual premises, lead inexorably to the conclusion that men like Biddle and Bernanke should always be challenged with eternal vigilance by all people who would be free.